Claire Mathis had never fit into any of the boxes the world tried to fold her into, but she had learned long ago that silence could be its own kind of weapon. Sharp, patient, devastating. And it was that same silence she carried with her into the Delta Force selection camp at Fort Bragg, where 58 candidates had arrived, and 57 of them already didn't take her seriously, including the instructors, who gave her the kind of once-over that stripped a person bare with a glance, decided she wasn't combat-shaped enough, didn't have the war-scarred stare or a voice that barked authority, and certainly didn't look like someone capable of carrying another grown man through a storm of bullets. But Claire wasn't there to convince them with chatter or bravado. She had grown up in the bitter wind of Cheyenne, Wyoming, where words froze in your throat if you didn't use them wisely, and her father, a Vietnam vet turned gunsmith, had taught her that aim came not from strength, but stillness, that when your pulse steadied like a lake in winter, and your breath moved like wind through reeds, you could hit anything you set your eye on, even if it was 2 miles away and breathing. He died when she was 17, and his funeral was the first time she ever realized how invisible she felt to the world, surrounded by uniforms that saluted her father but barely nodded to her, and it was in that loneliness that her conviction was born, not loud or dramatic, but planted deep like a root that twisted tighter every time someone told her she couldn't, wouldn't, shouldn't try to be anything more than what she already was. And so, years later, when she stepped into the early morning mud of 40, Bragg's proving ground with nothing but a regulation pack and a quiet resolve, she knew the men would laugh behind her back, knew the evaluators would underline her name with invisible ink that meant temporary, but still she pressed forward, through the endless days of crucible marches, through obstacle courses designed to break backs and wills, through meals missed and bruises worn like second skin, never once complaining, never once stepping out of line to explain herself, even when her partner dropped during the sandbag run, and left her dragging his unconscious body 50 yards through thorny sludge because he'd underestimated the burn in his lungs. And she didn't whimper, didn't shout, just lowered her center of gravity and pulled, inch by inch, until they both crossed the line, blood running down her calf from a gash she hadn't even noticed. Her breath short, but her gaze level with the evaluators, who scribbled silently and didn't look up. It wasn't just the physical trials, it was psychological too. Days where no one was allowed to speak, where they blindfolded you and left you in a soundproof room, fed you misinformation, made you question every decision, and Claire never cracked, not even when they tried to pit the men against her by planting rumors that she was there for diversity, not merit. A lie that stung but didn't surprise her, because she had lived her whole life being underestimated, and she had made peace with it, the kind of peace that gave her focus, because when your whole world told you you didn't belong, you either proved them right or rewrote the ending, and Claire chose the latter. Still, she knew, deep down, that this wasn't about beating the test. It was about beating their perception of her, and that meant playing a game she was never meant to win, especially when the doctors pulled her aside after the ruck march, and said she was being medically dropped for stress fractures, even though she'd passed every checkpoint, even though she'd said nothing about her swelling ankle, even though she had completed every single task without fail, and the injustice of it didn't register on her face but flared like a wildfire in her chest, because she knew, this wasn't about injury, it was about image, and someone in the hierarchy had decided that she didn't look like what Delta was supposed to look like, and that kind of gatekeeping didn't leave a paper trail. It left people like her behind. They gave her 48 hours to clear out, a handshake and a form to sign, and the men who hadn't spoken to her all week suddenly started giving her those pity glances, the kind that said too bad but didn't mean it, and Claire packed in silence. Her bag heavier than before because now it was filled with rage she couldn't place, grief for something she hadn't even had the chance to prove, and a memory of her father's words echoing louder than ever. If they don't see you, make them feel you. And that night, she sat beneath the tin overhang of the barracks, rain hammering the roof like gunfire, and she stared out at the range in the distance, her swollen ankle thudding with every heartbeat, her mind scanning the past, not just the last week but the last years, all the hours she'd spent on the mountainside with that old Remington, wind tearing at her coat, adjusting for every condition because she'd read once what the Delta record was, to the 375 meters, and something inside her had whispered, "You can beat that." And so she trained, not for the applause, but for herself, for the version of Claire that had always been overlooked, and now she was about to leave without ever having fired a shot. But then, before dawn, she rose, dressed, limped to the armory and signed out her weapon. No questions asked since she still had 2 days on base, and she walked in darkness to the furthest station on the range, set up her position, calculated. Wind speed with a wetted finger and instinct, dialed her scope, and stared through the glass at a target nearly invisible to the naked eye, taped a note to the tower that read, "One shot, one chance. Watch," then lay prone, heartbeat slow, breath measured, and waited for the moment when the wind dipped just enough, and then, with a single exhale, she pulled the trigger like she was plucking a string on a harp, and the silence afterward was the loudest thing she'd ever heard, until, seconds later, the distant ping of the metal target echoed across the range like a bell rung for the dead, and Claire smiled not because she'd hit it, but because she knew. She'd shattered the record by 26 meters, and when the sun rose and the instructors came to review footage from the range cam, the base was already whispering the name Mathis, rippling through halls and mess tents and corridors like static. And when Colonel Miles, the same man who signed her dismissal, saw the shot, he didn't say a word, just stared at the screen, jaw clenched, and for the first time someone didn't see Claire as a woman or a civilian or a mistake. They saw her as a force, and she wasn't even done yet. Claire didn't return to Delta Force to prove anyone wrong. She came back to finish something she started long before she ever stepped onto the proving grounds, and as she walked past the same barracks where she'd once packed in quiet defeat, this time her name wasn't whispered in pity but in hushed respect. And though no ceremony marked her reinstatement, every look from the hardened operators she passed told her the tide had turned, not because they'd been forced to accept her, but because they had no choice. Excellence is undeniable, and Claire had become a living embodiment of what no one had expected but now couldn't ignore. Discipline without ego, instinct without recklessness, and pain carried like armor. In the weeks that followed, she was embedded in shadow missions across continents, the kind never spoken of in Pentagon briefings, and in each she left behind stories the world would never hear, rescuing a hostage child from a warlord's compound without firing a shot, navigating a collapsing tunnel system in Kabul to extract injured teammates while oxygen ran low, and once, held at gunpoint by a double agent she'd trusted, she simply closed her eyes, breathed in, and disarmed him with one swift movement that later became required viewing at the training academy. Not because it was flashy, but because it was pure control. But it wasn't just her skill that left a mark. It was her stillness in the face of chaos, her refusal to speak when others shouted, her way of seeing people beyond their rank or their reputation. And that's why, when a mission in Mogadishu went fatally wrong and the unit's lead bled out in Claire's arms whispering apologies, it was her the remaining squad turned to, not command. And she led them out through smoke and betrayal with a hand as steady as her aim, carrying not just her pack but the weight of every voice that ever told her she wasn't enough. And it was in that moment, as dust settled on her blood-stained boots, that she knew this journey wasn't about revenge or validation. It was about permission, the kind you give yourself when no one else will. And when she finally returned home months later, stepping off that silent tarmac with no one to greet her, no cameras, no applause, just the wind brushing through her hair like an old friend, she reached into her duffel, pulled out the Delta patch they once said she'd never earn, and pinned it above her father's old Remington that still hung above the fireplace, whispering to the quiet room, "We did it, Dad." Because in the end, Claire hadn't just broken a record, she had rewritten the blueprint of what it meant to belong, and in doing so, she became the story whispered to every underestimated soul who dared to dream beyond the walls built to contain them.